This is Robert Kaplan from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This is a podcast series about great power rivalry in an age of global demons.
If Russia continues to interfere with our democracy, I'm prepared to take further actions to respond.
Cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion.
The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
How will conflicts between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia interact with pandemics, climate change, massive cyber attacks, state failures, and other terrors of a global media age? You'll want to listen closely to the breaks, because you might be one of the lucky listeners to receive my latest book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian, as part of a giveaway. Today I have with me Ashley Tellis, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and arguably Washington's most articulate and best expert on Asian, Indian, Chinese, and the relationship between major powers in terms of geopolitics in Asia and with the United States. Ashley, how are you?
I'm well, Bob. It's good to see you.
Good. So we'll get started immediately. My first question is, how is Modi doing, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India? I mean, we've had COVID, we've had this awful experience India has been through with COVID-19. Is he exiting out of that? And what are his political prospects in a post-COVID world in India?
So I think when one looks at the last few years, it's clearly been a bad patch for Prime Minister Modi. Even before the pandemic, the Indian economy was slowing down quite noticeably. And the pandemic, of course, has been a tragedy both at a human level and in terms of Modi's ambitions to accumulate national power rapidly. So he suffered two reverses on both these counts, a slowing economy and now the pandemic. The good news is that the worst of the pandemic seems to be behind India, though everyone is cautiously waiting for the possibility of a third wave. But strikingly, this does not seem to have dented either the Prime Minister's authority or his popularity. And there are many reasons for this. But if one looks at this from the outside, I think one can be optimistic that India will come out of the pandemic at some point with its capabilities still largely intact, that the Indian economy will make a slow but significant comeback in the years to come, and that Modi will be in charge of what is still a relatively successful India, which of course matters to the United States because of all its geopolitical implications, given the emergence of U.S. China competition.
Yes. So Modi certainly has a path to be reelected yet again, do you think?
I think so, in part because, as I said, his personal popularity still remains relatively high. Most of the polling in India shows that he has a 65% or thereabouts approval rate, which is absolutely phenomenal for a country that has undergone such crises. And because the national opposition is still very weak and fragmented. So he's the only national leader with a reputation that carries him nationwide. So I think when the next election comes around, which will be, around 2024, that will be his election to lose.
What is the root of his continued popularity, Ashley? Is it Hindu nationalism? Is it the virtual annexation of Kashmir? Is it some of the deregulation that he's carried out in the economy? What is it the root of this loyalty to the leader despite COVID-19 and India's horrible experience with it?
So I would actually say, surprising though it may sound, that none of the factors that you flagged actually drive his popularity. What drives his popularity in my mind is the remarkable charisma of the man and his history. He's seen as the quintessential rags to power story. He had humble origins. He's risen to the nation's highest office on the strength of essentially his own political acuity, the fact that he is celibate, that he is single, he doesn't have a family, is seen as positioning him uniquely for national service. He is seen as personally incorrupt and driven to bring change essentially to India's poor. And we need to keep that demographic in mind, right? For all of India's accomplishments in the last several decades, it's still a relatively poor country with a good, 50% or so of the population, nowhere near prosperity. And it is this population that sees Modi as being one of themselves.
This is fascinating because when I interviewed Modi in 2008, when he was state minister of Gujarat, he certainly came across as a sort of warrior monk. And with all his pens and pencils and his pocket protector, talking about statistics, he seemed obsessed in an almost obsessive compulsive way with his job, like no politician I had ever encountered before.
I think you've captured it well, Bob. The warrior monk is really, there is an ascetic quality to the way he conducts himself personally. And there is absolutely no doubt that he is driven by a desire to make India achieve its destiny. I mean, it comes across, when you speak to him personally, when he speaks in these large public meetings, where he has literally a few hundreds of thousands of people gathered together. He can sort of rouse people's emotions and commit them to a national purpose in a way that, he has few peers in Indian politics today. So I think his charisma is really, at the end of the day, a driving force. And all the elements that you identified probably matter, but on the margins.
You had said that the opposition is still in disarray. Is the Nehruvian dynasty dead in India, or can it be resurrected within the Congress Party? And where does the Congress Party go from here, if the Congress Party, in fact, is the opposition going forward?
So there are several dimensions to that question. First, the Nehruvian elite is not dead because Nehru's legacy is quite long-lasting. And there are large pockets, both among elites and among the masses, that would still see Nehru as a quite remarkable Indian leader. So that's not disappearing from the Indian political landscape. But the institutional, inheritance of Nehru, which is carried primarily by the Congress Party, there I would say the leadership of the Congress Party is in considerable disarray. Now, the Congress Party still has remarkable organization. It's present in every part of the country. It has terrific bench depth in terms of leaders beyond the top, leaders in the states, leaders in the districts. It is a very impressive organization. But where it has failed is really at the apex, where the folks around, Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi, who are still the titular heads of the party, I think they are seen as weak and inadequate, to the party's ambitions. And unless there is change that occurs really at the core of the party's leadership, and in my view, that would require both Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi to think seriously about encouraging a new generation of Congress leaders to take the helm. Unless that happens, I think the Congress will likely, remain in perpetual decline. However, I want to make one other point. What is very interesting is that the opposition today is less and less a centralized institution like the Congress, and more regional parties that are opposed to the BJP. And remember the numbers, right? Even at its peak, the BJP never secured more than about 37% of the popular vote. which means there is a large section of the Indian population that is willing to vote for non-BJP alternatives. Now, the reason why these non-BJP alternatives never capture power at the central level is because they're fragmented and divided, and because the Indian electoral system is a first-past-the-post system. So even a large number of opposition votes get divided among many opponents. And that's what gives the BJP, its ability to amass power even though the popular vote does not necessarily reflect a majority.
When we come back, Ashley and I will talk about the future prospects for a united India and its place among the great powers in Asia.
This podcast is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. Founded in 1955, FPRI is committed to producing the highest quality scholarship and expert analysis through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For more information about FPRI and our work to educate the public on the most pressing foreign policy issues of the day, please visit www.fpri.org.
Is this portend of geographic fracturing of India going forward in the future? Or not totally, I don't want to put it in apocalyptic terms, but India was always a varied country of states, a federal system where the states had real identity. Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, etc., Karnataka, they all had real identities. Is this getting stronger? Or what you just said is just a manifestation of what was always there?
I think it's a manifestation of what is always there. And I think there are two polarities which are worth emphasizing. First, the unity of India as a political entity is no longer at risk. There is simply no way that India will break up in a way that was feared in the 1950s. Indians have realized their essential unity despite all their diversities. And that is the first polarity that needs to be recognized. But there is a second polarity, and that is the diversities and the particularities are real, but they are manifested more and more at the level of legitimate state politics. So India's states have now become reflections of its diversity. And so when you see the opposition to a hegemonic BJP, that opposition is now appearing around what might be crudely called the periphery of India. So, for example, the states of West Bengal, the states of peninsular India, which are separated, even in a cultural sense, from the heartland. This is where the opposition to the BJP resides. And I think this opposition will continue to persist. It will thrive. The BJP has actually not been able to penetrate deeply beyond its base in the heartland. So the heartland is essentially, the Gangetic Plain. So it's North India, the entire geographical region, which is north of the peninsula. And so it has extended, it is now present in the Northeast for the first time. It has made a few inroads into South India, but certainly not enough to make it hegemonic as an all-India entity. There is reason to, imagine that you could get alternative governments to the BJP if, for example, the opposition could unite, if they could create, a coalition that challenges the BJP in a one-on-one encounter, rather than a fragmented opposition challenging the BJP, with multiple representatives in various constituencies.
All right. As Indian politics organically leads to India's relation with the outside world, where are we? We have some big issues here. We have Kashmir, we have Arunachal Pradesh, we have Aksai Chin. Where is the northern India border dispute now? Have the two sides more or less agreed to disagree? Or what I mean is keep it on a certain level of conflict and tension, but not raise it up to a higher level?
I think that's pretty much where it is. So there is a continuing standoff because the Chinese are still in occupation of some territories that India claims. And I don't mean sort of the Chinese occupation of territories that went back to the 1960s. I'm talking about the new occupations that, occurred in the last year and a half, last 2 years. That still is in play. There are ongoing negotiations to try and get the Chinese to disengage. They've disengaged from 2 of the 4 sites that they occupied. But what has changed, and this is really important, for the theme of your broadcast, Bob, is that Sino-Indian relations now have become much more conflictual than they were in the recent past. Because India saw the aggression of the last, couple of years as really signaling a determined Chinese effort to keep India down, to put it in a box, to embarrass it, both in an international arena as well as with respect to India's domestic politics. And so Indian attitudes to China have hardened in ways that, was simply impossible to imagine as recently as I would say 3 to 4 years ago. And that is a significant change.
India's hostility now, if we can call it that, has gradually, actually over the last 15 or 20 years, migrated from India-Pakistan to India-China. And that, of course, raises India's stature because by competing and conflicting with China, a great power, India is on a playing field that is more prestigious than the India-Pakistan rivalry. Could you put it that way?
I think that is certainly true, but I don't think that shift from India-Pakistan to India-China has come about simply because of the changes in the patterns of India's hostility. I think it has occurred fundamentally because of India's economic transformation. India's economic transformation after 1991 took the country on a radically upward trajectory in terms of economic growth, which allowed it to pull away from Pakistan in ways that were simply not possible prior to 91. India grew after 91 at roughly about 7%, which brought it much closer to China's rate of growth compared to Pakistan's rate of growth. So I think it is the changing economic trajectory of India in the reform period that really allowed us to think of it as China's peer rather than Pakistan's peer. And now that Indian hostility towards China has grown because of the crisis in the border, then I think that pair, the India-China pair, will certainly become the more enduring, of the 2 rivalries, both within the subcontinent and, of course, in the broader geopolitical arena.
In the broader geopolitical arena, I've always thought that the United States does not actually need a formal alliance with India. India, just being India, as big as it is, and where it is located in the Asian subcontinent close to China, as long as it keeps growing economically and militarily, even without an alliance with the U.S., India would serve as a hedge against China for the Americans.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, this was exactly the vision that motivated us in the Bush administration, because we understood all too clearly that India is too big, too proud to ever become an alliance partner of another state. And so from a US perspective, what we concluded then was that the best way forward was for India to remain independent, but certainly become more capable. Because as you point out, an India that is powerful automatically balances China. And to the degree that it conduces to multipolarity in Asia, that actually is an American interest. And so encouraging India's growth, supporting its rise in power was very much a US objective. Now the question going forward, though, given that India has faltered in recent years, whether it ought to be thinking of more visible forms of affiliation with the United States. That's really the question for Delhi. And the question for Washington is that if India falters, hopefully it won't, but if it does, the question for us is, should we be encouraging India to think in terms of more visible forms of affiliation? It will never be an alliance, but are there more privileged kinds of partnerships that one can imagine and that we ought to encourage India to consider? I think those are the policy questions really for the next 3 to 5 years. Now, if India actually bounces back in a way that it did after 91, this is irrelevant because then India will grow, India will become capable, and that's good enough for us. But we have to think also of the downside possibilities. If India does not go back to that high growth trajectory, does New Delhi have to think of more visible, affiliations with the United States? And should the United States in turn be encouraging that?
When we return, Ashley Tellis and I will discuss India's discomfort with an intensifying U.S. China rivalry.
If you're enjoying the Global Demons podcast, you'll also enjoy Robert D. Kaplan's latest book, The Good American, a sweeping yet intimate story of the most influential humanitarian you've never heard of, Bob Gersony, who spent 4 decades in crisis zones around the world. Thanks to our sponsor, Random House, you can win a signed copy of The Good American just by listening to this podcast. All you have to do is subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. We will have a random drawing and announce the winner on our 13th and final episode.
Does India become uncomfortable as U.S. China relations have deteriorated? As the U.S. has essentially, everyone argues whether it's a Cold War between the U.S. and China, but the very fact that they argue about it and use the term means that in a way it is a Cold War, deny it as they might, because the term itself has been re-legitimized for the first time after 1989. Is India uncomfortable with this? Because it would seem to me that India is very comfortable with a normal U.S.-China rivalry. It can play one side against the other. But if there's really going to be, the actual possibility of military conflict between the U.S. and China, this puts India in a difficult situation because India is so geographically close to China that it may not be able to afford being openly hostile to China.
You've put your finger on what is the heart of India's Goldilocks problem. What India does not want is obviously open, high-octane U.S.-China hostility, because that pushes India in a position where either the United States or China might demand that it choose sides. The United States, because we are bound with India both by values and interests, and China simply because it's so close to Delhi. On the other hand, India also does not want to find itself in a situation where there is US-China collusion. And after 1971, the Indians have become very sensitive to the fear the US and China might end up in a collusive relationship or a condominium, or as Xi Jinping would like to call it, a new type of great power relationship where both sides essentially act in unison. That would be just as dangerous for India. So if you were to ask me how India sort of manages this balance, I think the Indians would be most comfortable with a competitive US-China relationship, because that gives India greater options, but not necessarily a US-China relationship that is defined by open and relentless hostility.
India becomes sort of the bellwether nation, the bellwether power in great power competition. In other words, India is not going to determine the future of U.S.-China relations. But on the other hand, where India sits, what its attitudes are, will tell us most of what we need to know regarding the state of great power competition in the world.
Very much so. It also has a demonstration effect, right? Because there are many other smaller countries in Asia that are looking to India to play its part in balancing the rise of Chinese power. And so there are demonstration effects. There are consequences also for sub-strategic realignment. So, for example, the new relationship that has materialized between India and Japan in recent years, the growing interest in the Quad, and the triangular relationships between India, Japan, Australia, India, Japan, Vietnam, India, Japan, Taiwan. There are all sorts of, subcontinental partnerships, minilateral arrangements, as it were, really depend on India's success.
Now, the Quad is India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. Is it a media creation? Because it would seem to me that without U.S. leadership, it's hard for the Quad to be really effective. Or am I wrong? Is this changing?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the Quad is an interesting innovation, but I would not exaggerate its importance because the United States already has very close ties bilaterally with both Japan and Australia. And so bringing India, which is in many ways a non-aligned state, into this quadrangular arrangement is an innovation. It holds a lot of promise, but I don't think it is the answer to the security challenges, certainly facing the United States and Japan, because on the most important things that matter, which is military security, I think the Quad will play at most a peripheral role.
It's interesting because the Quad gives India a sort of indirect formal alliance with the United States. It's kind of in an alliance with the U.S. without having a strategic alliance bilaterally with the United States.
Yes, at a symbolic level, but India has been very cautious to push against any Quad endeavors that take the form of a military partnership. So India has been quite emphatic that the purpose of the Quad must be diplomatic consultation, socializing the region to the challenges posed by China. It should also become a vehicle for economic cooperation, for technology cooperation, for anything you can imagine except military cooperation. Because for the reasons that you pointed out earlier, India's own proximity to China, India is very cautious about not conveying to the Chinese the impression that it wants to be part of a general militarized balancing of China in the Indo-Pacific. India has always prized its independence. And so it's willing to engage in partnerships that are eclectic, and the Quad is one of them. But it doesn't want to become part of a military alliance. And so it has pushed back, actually, on the Quad expressing itself singularly in terms of high security.
Nevertheless, what I do see in Asia is that America's Asian allies and India are more deeply concerned about Chinese advancement than America's traditional European allies seem concerned about Russia's advance. In Europe, you have this situation in Germany where the Germans are going to be getting their energy from Russia. They're going to trade with China, and they'll be defended by the U.S. That's a great deal if you can get it. But in Asia, I see precisely because of the proximity to China and the entangling trade alliances, America's Asian allies are almost more honest. They openly need the United States more in order not to be Finlandized.
I think that diagnosis of yours is absolutely right. And I think the major difference in the two cases is the fact that China is a rising power and Russia is, if not declining, certainly not a rising power in the same way that China is. And so the Asian allies are locked in an environment where they genuinely are sort of sitting next door to a new hegemonic competitor to the United States. And one that, although slowing, certainly shows no signs of decaying as yet. And so China poses a very serious problem. And when you add to that the fact that the Chinese have revanchist ambitions, that the Chinese have demonstrated remarkable assertiveness with very little pushback, particularly in the South China Sea and elsewhere, there is reason for the Asian allies to be fearful. Uncertainties in US politics in the last few years have not helped either. They were comfortable with America's protector role. Now even that is being called in question.
Because Biden did not win a landslide. America is still a divided country, so our Asian allies have to consider the possibility that it may revert back in the United States.
They don't see Trump as, the Trump phenomenon as simply epiphenomenal.
Yeah.
They recognize it is reflected in deep American divides about its role in the world. And that, of course, is enough reason for anxiety if you live next door to China.
Well, Ashley Tellis, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you and to listen to you.
As always, Bob, pleasure. Take care of yourself.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Demons podcast, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts and visit our website at www.fpri.org. For the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm Robert D. Kaplan.